Vladimir Putin. Nuclear. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. As the war continues between Russia and the Ukraine, the hoped-for swift blitzkrieg victory that it is anticipated that Vladimir Putin wanted has of course been denied him. I've explained elsewhere what Vladimir Putin is to enable you to understand his mindset and approach to many matters. Of course, as the war goes against him and pressure mounts, one of the questions that raises itself repeatedly is whether he would be moved to utilize nuclear weapons. To understand whether someone such as Vladimir Putin would issue an order for that to take place, one has to look at several things. First of all, what is Russia's nuclear arsenal and how does it work? Secondly, what are the circumstances by which consideration might be given to the use of nuclear weapons? And thirdly, how does that all fit into with regard to the type of individual that Vladimir Putin is? Well, first of all, let us look at the issue of, briefly, the nuclear weapons that Russia has. Nobody, of course, knows for absolute certain, other than the Russians themselves, how many nuclear weapons they have. And essentially they're divided into strategic weapons, which are deployed on intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and those launched from bombers, and those which are tactical weapons. With regard to strategic nuclear weapons, the Federation of American Scientists estimates that there are 1,185 held on intercontinental ballistic missiles, 800 on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and 580 which could be air-launched from bombers. Quite simply, plenty of nuclear warheads that would cause devastation across their targets if launched. With regard to tactical weapons, there are estimated to be 1,912. Those are ones which can be launched from ground launchers, ships and bombers, but are not pre-deployed. The strategic nuclear weapons are the ones that generally most people think about in terms of a nuclear Armageddon, a sort of end-of-world scenario whereby, because modern strategic nuclear weapons have enormous power, standard ones can have yields of 500 kilotons, 800 kilotons, and even 1 megaton, which is equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT. To put that in perspective, the US Department of Energy estimated that the American bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had yields of 15 and 21 kilotons, respectively. Pretty small compared to standard yields of 500, 800, or even 1 megaton. The fact is, of course, that unleashing strategic nuclear weapons against targets would, of course, invite a response, and that response would come from the United States and other members of NATO, with the likelihood that mutually assured destruction would occur. And it is that scenario which has kept in balance effectively the nuclear taboo since 1945. And though the world has sailed close, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis being an example of that, neither side has launched that Armageddon. What then is the likelihood of Vladimir Putin launching strategic nuclear weapons? In my view, notwithstanding what he is, the view is extremely small indeed. Why? Notwithstanding his assessment as a narcissistic psychopath, the fact is that he doesn't want to die like anybody else would. And he's not mad. He's not insane. And consequently, his aim is the extension of his empire, as I've explained elsewhere, with regard to, in effect, causing a return to what was the Soviet Union. And this piecemeal invasion of the Ukraine was the start of trying to achieve that, although, of course, it has gone badly for him. If you have not already listened to my examination of what Vladimir Putin is through the detailed series, I'd invite you to do so. And if you want to understand precisely what his school and cadre are, you can access that either in the Knowledge Vault or in the membership section of this channel. A strategic launch of nuclear weapons is highly unlikely because of what it will represent. Effectively, the destruction of his own country. Remember, his status is such that he wants legacy. He wants to be remembered for having restored Russia to the might of the Soviet Union, with its satellite countries and red spreading out across the map. As I've explained in parts passive of my series about Vladimir Putin, the loss of the Soviet Union effectively wounded him, and it is part of what works for him with regard to the assertion of control to recover that. Causing a scenario of strategic launches of NATO's weapons and that of Russia would essentially prevent him having that legacy, and there would be no Soviet Union. And even backed against the wall, he's still unlikely to do it for two reasons. First of all, he would deem such a significant launch as a threat to his control, and therefore his aware narcissism isn't going to take him down that road. Instead, he would look to negotiate his way out of this and then pause and look to, on a later date, start the process again. Essentially, causing all-out nuclear war is not in his interest, even if he's back to the wall. It would result in the destruction of him and his country, not something that he wants to happen. He is not a loose cannon in that respect. And therefore, that is why I see the potential for him to unleash what people understand to be nuclear Armageddon as to be very low indeed, in fact, to be virtually inconceivable. Furthermore, the fact is that even if he were to issue the order, it is not the simple case, as the films would have you believe, that he presses a red button in a suitcase, but there's a chain of command for these things, and quite simply, that chain of command is likely to falter, and there would not be a launch. Quite simply, those that were tasked with doing it wouldn't want it to happen, because, as Sting once sang, I hope the Russians love their children too, and there'll be enough people in that chain of command to disobey it. Putin would give the order to launch, if it were ever to happen. As I've explained, I see that as unlikely. But even if he were, it's unlikely to be acted upon. And therefore, all-out nuclear Armageddon is highly unlikely. And so you don't have to start thinking about retreating to your bomb shelters just yet. The issue, more likely, is that he will utilize a tactical nuclear weapon. Tactical nuclear weapons are ones which are utilized, as I've mentioned, from ground launchers, ships and bombers. And essentially what has to happen is they need to be moved into place. The Federation of American Scientists believes that Russia has about 500 tactical Air Force nuclear weapons, a figure that includes gravity bombs and air-to-surface cruise missiles. Many of those would be delivered by aircraft that have been used on conventional bombing missions in the Ukraine. These planes include the Tu-22 backfire bomber that Russia has used to strike Ukraine and the Su-34 fullback, one of which Ukraine claimed to have shot down recently. However, more likely is the 9K-720 Iskander missile system, classified by NATO as the SS-26, which is a ground-based ballistic missile. There are, however, only about 100 of those in Russia's arsenal, and They would favour them because it's the most reliable and would be the one that would have the best chance of making to its target, not being shot down, not failing. Of course, this would still deliver grievous destruction, but not on the scale of launching a full-out nuclear attack. And the most likely thing that Putin would do is that if he felt that this would swing matters in his favour in order to gain the control that he craves, he is more likely, although not guaranteed of course, to utilise a tactical nuclear weapon. For reasons of maintaining control and the extension of legacy and wanting the resurgence of the Soviet Union, I do not see that an all-out strategic assault of nuclear weapons will occur. Furthermore, even if he were to order that, I do not see that that order would be acted upon. More likely, or still be it is not guaranteed and far from it, is the use of a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon. Here, the advantage that would be afforded to Putin is that there would not follow mutually assured destruction, because it would be localized. Of course, the world would be horrified at its use, and there would be outright condemnation. But dependent upon where he strikes, the West's response may alter. The fact is, if he were to utilize a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield and aimed it at, say, a Ukrainian city, this would cause a major problem because it would result in untold death and destruction. And with that large mushroom cloud in the air, the world would of course be reminded of the horrors of nuclear weapons. And the problem is that if he were to do that, he's in effect then, even still with a tactical nuclear weapon, breaking a taboo that has been held since 1945. And remember, he, as the type of narcissist that he is, still utilizes a facade. His facade isn't that of being kind or empathic. He's no mid-ranger, remember. Instead, his facade is one of power, of one of the iron fist and the velvet glove, that he is always the one in control. Sometimes brutish in the way that he goes about it, but it's about the maintenance of power. And therefore, he's not going to do something that's going to risk losing all of that power by inviting a sudden assault against his own country. If he were to launch a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon against a Ukrainian city, the fact that this, of course, would involve civilians would result in a likely response by NATO against Russia, thus again depriving him of legacy. He is not so stupid as to want to go down that route. Instead, the cunning and conniving mind that he operates is more likely to do this. And again, I repeat, it is not guaranteed that he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons, but if he was to do so, I see that it's more likely that where he will do so is to launch it at somewhere which is somewhere else. By that I mean, he doesn't send it against a city. Instead, he might use a small tactical nuclear weapon, let's say, over a forest, to annihilate Ukrainian troops. Or perhaps utilised over Snake Island, which you'll know is of strategic concern and significance. Casualties would be low, but it would be a major flex by Putin to say, I am not afraid to use tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, and I just have. How you like me now? No city has been demolished, which would of course invoke the response that I've mentioned earlier. But instead, here, this would allow him the assertion of control by showing, you think that I'm going to back off quietly. I'm not. I have nuclear weapons, and guess what? I've just demonstrated that I'm not afraid to use them. And the issue is that this fits within the salami-slicing behaviour that a narcissist such as he would engage in. As mentioned earlier, to launch strategic weapons wholesale would be basically to invoke the end of his country and everything that he believes in. And that would be a self-sacrificing act that his narcissism wouldn't guide him to do. Even were he in the bunker desperate, this isn't a situation that he's going to do that. His narcissism just wouldn't allow him to do it. If he launches against a city, again, that's an easy one to condemn. Civilian casualties on a huge scale, the West would have no option but to act. But here, he injects, and this is what narcissists are often very good at doing, uncertainty as to response. Sure, a tactical nuclear weapon has been launched. Yes, there have been casualties, but they are military. Do we respond in kind, the West is asked, or would that escalate matters? And in essence, such an act would be a clever move for Putin to engage in, because it would show that he's not frightened to use the weapons and therefore cause the question to be asked, would he go even further this time with the use of a tactical launch? Or is it the case of, well, the taboo has sort of been pushed but not yet been broken. Do we really want to be the ones that would respond to break the taboo? And therefore, such a launch would enable him to basically retreat while still, in effect, holding a gun to the West. A little bit like in the movies when you see somebody whip out a weapon and they're pointing it at the villains as they back out and save the girl. I've got a gun, I could use it, and nobody wants to invite the hero to shoot them, so they don't follow after him. Here, a similar situation could arise for Putin by utilizing one small tactical nuclear weapon in a somewhere else scenario that would then enable him to continue by essentially holding the possibility of further use over the West to regain face and possibly negotiate his way out of the mess that has been occurred without tipping the balance so far as to cause the West to respond in kind. In essence, he would put a foot on the rung of an escalation ladder without actually racing up it, as he would do if he was to launch a full-scale strategic assault. Ultimately, there remains a risk. But it is a low probability risk, even for one such as Vladimir Putin, because remember, what is it that his narcissism wants? Control. In the same way that I've explained in my video about the narcissist and suicide, it's actually very rare for that to happen. And therefore, he is not mad. He's not a loose cannon. He functions through his prism of narcissism, and he wants that control. He doesn't want to go up in some kind of self-sacrificial blaze of nuclear glory. Far from it. But where he faces a loss of face, which amounts to a loss of control, one option for him is to utilize the tactical battlefield nuclear weapon. And of course, because that's over a forest that kills troops, the rest of the world might not react in anywhere near the way that they would do if it was on a city or, of course, a full strategic launch. That enables him perhaps to argue terms, save a degree of face without the West having the difficult decision to make of do we actually respond in kind or not, and escalate matters up that nuclear ladder, and to enable the nuclear taboo to remain intact and in place. Essentially, this nuclear taboo works for both sides and has prevented both sides from ever launching a full-scale assault. What I see here is the probability of him going nuclear remains low, and if he were to do it, it would be for the purpose of saving face, to maintain control so that he can negotiate his way out of matters, agree terms, whilst holding a gun to the West's head by utilising a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon on a small scale to show, I've done it once, do you think I might do it again? And that's what the West has to weigh up. That is where I see matters potentially going to, with regard to the nuclear question. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.